So for today's movie review, I'll be reviewing Hellboy, the 2019 reboot of the Hellboy franchise that's had a rather long, sad, and frustrating production history. Because back in 2008, Hellboy 2, The Golden Army was released, and during its initial opening weekend, the movie was ranked #1 at the box office, supposedly making more money than its predecessor, and at the time of the film's release, it was the biggest opening for any movie to be directed by Guillermo del Toro until 2013 when he made Pacific Rim, and on top of that, the movie got generally good reception. However, 1 week later, The Dark Knight would soon be released in theaters, dethroning The Golden Army to a point that The Dark Knight became the highest grossing movie of 2008 and got such positive reception that The Dark Knight has become the most talked about superhero movie of all time, to a point that people still talk about it to this day. With Hellboy 2 The Golden Army, on the other hand, it wasn't so lucky, because the same weekend The Dark Knight came out, The Golden Army's box office performance dropped 71% during that weekend, and the movie was quickly forgotten about, in that sense where no one really talked about it anymore. Hell, I think I've seen more people talk about The Incredible Hulk from 2008 more times in this day and age than The Golden Army, which is a shame because I actually think Hellboy 2 The Golden Army is a very under-recommended superhero movie, but that's a whole nother topic for another day. Or, if I had seen people talk about The Golden Army, it was usually in relationship to how it set up potential storylines for the third Hellboy movie, and not necessarily talking about the movie itself. And while on the subject of Hellboy 3, the idea of a third Hellboy movie ended up in development hell for years because people couldn't decide whether or not the movie was in production or not in production. And the further the third Hellboy movie was in development hell, it just seemed more and more that the movie would never happen. But sometime around early 2017, Guillermo del Toro asked people on Twitter whether or not they wanted to see Hellboy 3, and an overwhelming majority stated that they do indeed want to see a third Hellboy movie. And sure enough, Guillermo del Toro actually went around asking various studios whether or not they would want to produce the movie, but sometime either mid to late February, Guillermo del Toro announced on Twitter that Hellboy 3 is 100% not going to happen because no one wanted to give Guillermo del Toro the budget that he wanted. And this made me both really sad and angry at the same time, because on one hand, I was indeed sad that we would never get that final installment in Guillermo del Toro's Hellboy trilogy, but the way I saw it, I was at least happy with the 2 installments that we did get. Now, the reason as to why I got so angry at the time occurred sometime in the middle of 2017 when I saw a trailer for XXX The Return of Xavier Cage. Because here's a third installment to a franchise that has not been relevant since 2005 that no one talks about. The movies also have been panned by both movie critics along with the general movie-going audience. And here's the thing, you're telling me that we couldn't get the third and final installment to Guillermo del Toro's Hellboy trilogy, a third installment that people wanted to see for years, yet for some reason we get a XXX movie that no one wanted to see. That confuses me so much because it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. But anywho, as time went on, it was revealed that a third Hellboy movie would be made, but it would take the form of a reboot that would be directed by Neil Marshall, the same guy who directed movies ranging from Dog Soldiers, The Descent, Doomsday to Centurion, while the eponymous hero of Hellboy would be played by David Harbour of Stranger Things fame. And as production progressed, the title of the movie was soon revealed to be Hellboy, Rise of the Blood Queen. But sometime in mid-August of 2017, for some reason, the subtitle of Rise of the Blood Queen was dropped, and the movie was simply just called Hellboy. And yeah, there's a few other things that I could bring up, but this intro has gone on long enough. So my big question is, with this movie being a reboot, does it justify the existence of a third Hellboy movie that isn't the final installment of Guillermo del Toro's Hellboy trilogy. As for the plot of the movie, Hellboy, the son of the devil, who happens to be a member of a top secret organization designed to hunt down monsters, is given the task of going to the countryside to battle some giants. Meanwhile, a pig monster resurrects an evil sorceress known as the Blood Queen who seeks vengeance upon mankind. And now it's up to Hellboy, along with some unlikely allies, to stop the Blood Queen from destroying the world. In terms of what I liked about the movie, well, actually, before I go any further, I still consider Ron Perlman's take on Hellboy to be the definitive take on the character, to a point that anytime I read the comic book occasionally, I hear Ron Perlman's voice through the lines of dialogue in the comic. That being said, I actually really do enjoy Dave Harbour's performance of this incarnation of Hellboy. Sure, he's nowhere near as charming or hard-boiled as the Ron Perlman incarnation, but I think Dave Harbour's take on this character is fun and charming in his own way. For example, Ron Perlman's Hellboy is like a supernatural Dirty Harry, whereas Dave Harbour's Hellboy is like a supernatural Dale Dobson from Tucker and Dale versus Evil, in that sense, where Dave Harbour's incarnation of Hellboy act like a teenage hillbilly in a fun kind of way. And on top of that, I also think the filmmakers made a really good decision by casting Dave Harbour as Hellboy. After all, who else are you gonna get to play Hellboy that isn't Ron Perlman? You get Dave Harbour, who already played Sheriff Hopper on the Netflix TV show Stranger Things, considering that Sheriff Hopper is a detective who deals with the paranormal. So it would only make sense to cast Dave Harbour as this new incarnation of Hellboy. I also do appreciate the fact that the movie does things differently from the original Hellboy movie, where it goes about the origin for this take of the character differently and more accurately to the comics. Sure, it's not handled well, but I'll talk about that later. And it doesn't feature the exact same cast of characters. Sure, you got characters like Hellboy and Professor Broom, which you basically need, but with some of the other support cast members, the movie doesn't go out of its way to reuse characters that we've seen before. Instead, the filmmakers decided to utilize support characters that didn't have the chance to appear in the Guillermo del Toro movies. For example, instead of getting Liz Sherman, who's not only a fire starter but also Hellboy's love interest, we instead get Alice Monaghan, a spirit medium who acts as Hellboy's sidekick. And instead of getting Abe Sapien, the Gillman who acts as the brains of the operation, we instead get Ben Dynamo, the Were-Jaguar, who fulfills the same kind of purpose, with a bit more bronze added to the mix. I also love how this movie really embraces the weirdness of the Hellboy comic. For example, with a character like Alice Monaghan, who's the spirit medium, as I mentioned a few moments ago, if this was any other spirit medium in any other movie, usually you would have the character find a dead body or enter a place that's filled with spirits, and you would have the person either get possessed by the spirit in question and have the spirit talk through the person, or maybe you see them talking to the spirit face to face. With this movie, on the other hand, we see Alice touch the dead body of somebody, and they proceed to upchuck this organic sack that takes on the form of the dead person and proceeds to communicate to Hellboy and his allies. And the first time I saw that occur in the movie theater, this for me was a genuine what the fuck kind of moment, because on pen and paper, it's something that I've seen before, but the way it happens is a whole nother story altogether. I also thought the various action scenes that occur throughout the movie were a ton of fun to watch, with my favorite of the bunch being the big cathedral fight that occurs at the very end of the movie, where we see Hellboy and Ben Dynamo in his Were-Jaguar form battling the pig monster Grugot, who so happens to be supersized thanks to the Blood Queen. Now we enter the part of the movie review in which I begin discussing the aspects of the movie that I had mixed feelings towards, starting with the way this movie presents Hellboy's origin. Because on the one hand, the movie isn't an origin story, since it already establishes Hellboy as a pre-existing character, while slowly revealing his backstory as it progresses. And I think this was a smart move on the filmmaker's part, considering that the 2004 Hellboy movie already did a good job of acting as an origin story for Hellboy to a point that it doesn't need to be retold again. And I do like how this movie expands on Hellboy's backstory, in which he wasn't just summoned by Nazis. It also turns out Hellboy is a living descendant of King Arthur himself, which is very accurate to the comics. The problem that I have with the movie in terms of how it conveys this information has to do with the movie doesn't establish that Hellboy is a living descendant of King Arthur until the start of the third act of the movie. And when this information is presented, it comes straight out of nowhere. Now sure, it does lead to a payoff with him using Excalibur. However, I think it would have been a better idea if throughout the movie we give little hints here and there that Hellboy has a fascination with the Arthurian legend to a point where he feels he has a personal connection with King Arthur, he just doesn't know it yet. Then I think the payoff to revealing Hellboy being a living descendant of King Arthur would have been handled a lot better. Another aspect of the movie I have mixed feelings towards are the special effects, because on the one hand, the movie actually has a combination of both practical and CGI effects. Starting with the practical effects, because I was not expecting this movie to have practical effects in it whatsoever. So seeing that this movie utilized some practical stuff was a pleasant surprise to me. Now sure, it's got nothing on the special effects that were done by Rick Baker in the original Hellboy movie, but I still think the practical effects are really good. And just remember, the filmmakers so easily could have had Hellboy be depicted through motion capture, but they didn't. They actually had David Harbour put on some makeup and actually appear physically in front of the camera as Hellboy himself, which I thought was a wise decision on the filmmaker's part. The CGI, on the other hand, is all over the place, because there are certain points in time where the CGI is competently good enough to function as intended, with some examples ranging from the electrical effects seen on the spears that the Osiris Club members use while on the hunt, to the Camazotz vampire that we see at the very beginning of the movie. And there are certain points in time where the CGI is used very well, with a character like Grugach, which I'll talk about later. Although most of the time the CGI is really bad to a point that it came off as being very campy. And I haven't seen CGI that was this campy since Mortal Kombat Annihilation, which came out in 1997. This Hellboy reboot, on the other hand, came out in 2019, more than 2 decades after the release of Mortal Kombat Annihilation. And if I had to speculate in terms of why the CGI turned out to be so campy for this movie, I think it's one of those situations where the filmmakers were working against their budget, because when you look at the fight scene between Hellboy and the three giants, the way that fight is set up, it doesn't feel like a final product. If anything, it felt more like a pre-rendering of the fight scene than the final product. And there are several other examples that I could list, but I think you get my point. Another aspect to this movie that I have mixed feelings towards are the creature designs, because if you're someone who's paid attention to this channel long enough, you know that I love me some monster movies, and I always love monster designs. Starting with the monster designs that I thought worked well for the movie, that consist of Hellboy himself, Grugach, Camazotz vampire, along with the three giants. And on a side note, I actually do love how one of the giants looks like the Cyclops from the Seventh Voyage of Sinbad. I thought that was a nice touch. But anyway, I like these monster designs because not only do they look like they belong in this universe, but most of them, with the exception of the three giants, look like they were ripped straight from the Hellboy comics. As for some of the other monster designs that we see throughout the movie, mainly the large army of monsters that appear before the Blood Queen on Pendle Hill, those monsters look bad to me for the simple reason that they looked out of place within the context of this universe because they didn't look like they came from this movie. The monster army looked as if it came from the 2014 live-action Disney movie Maleficent because of how cartoony they looked, especially when you compare this army of monsters to some of the other creatures that I mentioned a few moments ago, which have a more comic book accurate look to them and look like they belong in this universe as opposed to this big cartoon monster army. Another aspect to this movie that I have mixed feelings towards is Hellboy's internal conflict that occurs halfway through the movie after he meets the vision of the Blood Queen for the first time, because on pen and paper this isn't such a bad idea considering that Hellboy is a monster who hunts other monsters to protect humans and wonders why humans and monsters can't just coexist with each other, and does feel bad about hunting other monsters because of this. My problem with this idea is that despite sounding good on pen and paper, it's not executed very well. Case in point, when you look at the way Ron Perlman's incarnation of Hellboy goes through an existential crisis back in the original Hellboy movie from 2004, it came off as very tragic, since that incarnation of the character wanted to blend in with human society and be accepted among the masses. In some ways, the Ron Perlman incarnation of Hellboy is very similar to that of the type of characters you would see in a classic Universal monster movie of the 1930s. With the Dave Harbour incarnation of Hellboy, on the other hand, that's not the case, since when you see that version of the character going through a existential crisis, it doesn't come off as tragic. He comes off more annoyed than anything else, acting like a spoiled rich kid who didn't get a fancy sports car on their birthday and proceeded to throw a temper tantrum by getting drunk with the cast and crew of Viva La Bam. As for the next aspect of the movie, I have mixed feelings towards the central villains of the movie, starting with the pig monster Grugach, who's basically the Sabretooth to Hellboy's Wolverine from the X-Men comics. But anywho, Grugach I like for several reasons. Reason number one, I think out of any henchman character we've seen within the Hellboy movies, he's consistently the most comical of the bunch and entertaining to watch on screen anytime he does appear. Reason number two, I do love the fact that we get to see some good old hybridization in terms of how he's depicted, in that sense where his head is completely CGI, allowing for some great facial expressions, but everything else from the neck down is a man-in-suit creation, which I think really benefits the character. Sure, by the time you get to the final fight of the movie, Grugach does indeed become fully CGI, but everything else leading up to that fight, he's still a man-suit creation with some CGI on top. My only real gripe with Grugach is that he isn't the main villain of the movie, because in the comics, he has a rather tragic backstory that goes something along the lines of this, or at least a more condensed version of his origin, since Grugach was a fearsome warrior from some fairy kingdom who fell in love with a human girl. Something bad happened, which sent him into limbo. Thousands of years later, we get that scene from the movie where he tries to become a changeling by replacing Alice, only to be branded by Iron from Hellboy. Then sometime later, I think he tries to become human once more, but Hellboy manages to trap his soul into that of a pig monster permanently. Now sure, the movie only covers about a fraction of his origin from the comics, but if Grugach was the only villain in this movie, and the movie itself included more material from his backstory, he probably could have been the most tragic villain we've seen within the context of a Hellboy movie, and potentially the most compelling since Prince Nuarda from Hellboy 2: The Golden Army. As for the main villain of the movie, Nimue the Blood Queen, in order for me to properly critique this character, I have to compare her to the Enchantress from Suicide Squad, since the two of them are very similar but also very different for a couple reasons. Because between the two, I think Nimue the Blood Queen not only has a cooler looking design design in comparison to that of the Enchantress, since her costume design fits the overall aesthetic of the movie that she appears in, but she's also played by Miva Jovovich, who's a much better actress than the actress that plays the Enchantress from Suicide Squad. And that's really the only positives that I have for Nimue, because I have a lot more problems with her than I do positive, which leads us right into the problems that I have with the movie, starting with Nimue herself, for several reasons. Reason number one, we don't know anything about Nimue herself in terms of her backstory or why she wants to wipe out mankind. All we know about her is that she is the Blood Queen who just wants to destroy mankind. Nothing more, nothing less. Now, compare her to the Enchantress, because at least with the Enchantress, we know that she is some ancient mystical being who, along with her brother, Incubus, were worshipped as gods, but at some point were sealed into some containers that were eventually opened, unleashing both her along with her brother, only to discover that mankind has stopped worshipping them as gods and come to the conclusion that in order for mankind to worship them again, they have to destroy technology because mankind relied so much on technology, thus giving the Enchantress a god complex, making the Enchantress a better written villain than Nimue, which is saying a lot. Reason number two, Nimue doesn't do much within the context of her own movie, because when I think about what she does within the context of this movie, she only does two significant things, which are infecting Alice with the plague and killing off both Grugach and Professor Broom in order to stress out Hellboy to kickstart the apocalypse. With the Enchantress, on the other hand, she does quite a bit within Suicide Squad, since she possesses the body of June Moon in order to function, knocks a regular civilian man out in order for him to get his ass by her brother Incubus so he can set her plans in motion, escapes the clutches of Amanda Waller, creates an evil army along with a doomsday weapon, and becomes whole again once reunited with her heart. And on top of that, she takes on the Suicide Squad with relative ease. Reason number three, the way in which Hellboy defeats Nimue I found to be rather anticlimactic, since there really wasn't much of a fight there to begin with. It felt like more of a prologue to the fight as opposed to the actual fight itself, whereas the Enchantress, on the other hand, not that I think her defeat was great by any means, but I felt that there was a lot more effort put into her defeat as opposed to Nimue's. Another problem I have with the movie is the way the movie itself keeps postponing the stakes revolved around Nimue, because it's established within the opening prologue after she gets cut up by King Arthur that if she were to be reassembled, she would not only unleash the plague, but also unleash the forces of darkness in order to wipe out mankind. Yet, halfway through the movie, when we see Grugach successfully gather all of the body parts of the Blood Queen and assemble her, she doesn't have all of her powers. So what happens next? She, along with Grugach, go back to the area in which she was chopped up since a nearby tree absorbed her blood, which contained all of her powers. Then Hellboy shows up. She's got a change in plans in terms of how she's about to execute them and leaves Hellboy with a choice. Then she arrives in London, starts to unleash the plague, but then manipulates Hellboy into unleashing the forces of darkness in the last 10 minutes of the movie. Now, compare this movie to Avengers Infinity War, since within the first 5 minutes of the movie, it's established that if Thanos was to get all of the Infinity Stones, he will wipe out half of the universe. And as the movie progresses, he slowly succeeds in obtaining each and every single stone until he actually obtains all the stones and snaps half of the universe out of existence. Because there was a consistency with that movie in terms of what were the stakes and how the movie handled said stakes. With this movie, on the other hand, it establishes the stakes but keeps pushing them back thanks to poor writing. Another problem that I have with the movie is the way the first half of the movie is set up because we have two different plots going on. One revolved around Hellboy joining the Osiris Club to hunt down some giants, and the other one revolving around Grugach gathering all of the severed limbs of the Blood Queen to resurrect her. And between these two congruent plotlines, they have nothing to do with each other, since you have the one plotline revolving around Grugach assembling the Blood Queen, which is important to the movie. Then you got the other one with Hellboy joining the Osiris Club to hunt down some giants, which has nothing to do with the Blood Queen whatsoever. And sometime after Hellboy kills all three giants, he, along with the rest of the support cast, stumble into the actual plot of the movie by complete accident. And this all occurs around the halfway point of the movie. And to add on top of that, the stuff revolved around the giants serves no real purpose in the grand scheme of things, to a point that you could have written all of the giant stuff out of the movie and the movie would still function the same way. Now, it'd be one thing if Grugach magically resurrected three giants to serve as a distraction for Hellboy. That would have made more sense. Another problem I have with the movie, well, to say the movie doesn't make any sense would be a clear understatement, because I could list several examples of how this movie doesn't really make any sense, but instead of listing every single example that occurs throughout the entire movie, I am only going to talk about one facet of the movie to basically represent the entirety of every single element that doesn't make sense within the context of this movie, taking the form of Baba Yaga, who in the comics is a reoccurring antagonist for Hellboy that's based off the Russian folklore witch of the same name. And Baba Yaga is such a prominent character in the comics to a point that you could have had a Hellboy movie in which Baba Yaga was the central villain. But this movie instead decided to make Baba Yaga a support character. And the way the filmmakers decided to incorporate his character into the story is where things don't make any sense. Because first time we see Baba Yaga, we're inside her house and we see her talking to Grugach, and both characters want to seek vengeance upon Hellboy for different reasons. Baba Yaga tells Grugach to assemble the Blood Queen to kill Hellboy, but sometime way later into the movie, Baba Yaga summons Hellboy to her house and offers Hellboy some help. And now I'm going to list off a bunch of reasons why that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Reason number one, why bother recruiting Grugach to resurrect the Blood Queen when you're going to portray the Blood Queen to help out Hellboy? Second, even if Baba Yaga didn't help out Hellboy, what benefit does she get from having the Blood Queen getting resurrected? That's never explained. Third, the relationship between Baba Yaga and the Blood Queen is never explained, since Baba Yaga seems to know a lot about the Blood Queen, yet it almost seems as if the Blood Queen herself knows absolutely nothing of Baba Yaga from what we see in the movie. For how and why Baba Yaga knows the locations to the severed limbs of the Blood Queen is never explained or addressed, because in the opening prologue, after King Arthur butchers the Blood Queen, we see him along with his men placing each of her limbs inside iron boxes that are not only impervious to magic, but also makes them undetectable by any witch. So how would Baba Yaga know the location to each and every single limb if they're placed inside cast iron boxes that are not only impervious to magic, but undetectable to witches? And for my final point, why did Hellboy leave Baba Yaga alive, considering that Baba Yaga has been known to kill kids, and we see severed limbs of kids and some dead corpses within Baba Yaga's house? And the thing is, if this was the Hellboy from the comics or even the Ron Perlman incarnation, Baba Yaga would have been dead. But for some reason, the David Harbour incarnation of Hellboy leaves Baba Yaga alive. Another problem that I have with the movie is the way this movie utilizes the source material, because despite this movie actually taking a lot more material from the Hellboy comics, it doesn't use it very well. For example, I'm going to compare everything revolved around Hellboy, the Osiris Club, and the Giants and establish how similar are they and how different are they. For example, everything revolved around the Osiris Club's hunt for the Giants is both similar but really different from the comic. Because in the movie, Hellboy is ordered by his father to join the Osiris Club on the hunt for the three giants, and while they're on the hunt, the Osiris Club ambushes Hellboy using electrified spears, and while the Osiris Club gets slaughtered by the three giants, Hellboy proceeds to single-handedly take out all three giants. This technically does happen in the comics, but the context is completely different, because in the comic, Hellboy stumbles into the hunt by complete accident and decides to offer his help to the Osiris Club to hunt down the giants, which they let him, leading to the Osiris Club to ambush Hellboy, but instead of using electrified spears, they use anti-magic spears, which almost kill Hellboy. This would eventually lead into Hellboy's battle with the three giants, but he doesn't fight the three giants in his normal form. He fights and kills all three giants while in his Beast of the Apocalypse form, since he was still experiencing trauma from the Osiris Club nearly killing him with the anti-magic spears. Also, to add on top of that, this movie draws a lot of inspiration from the following Hellboy comics: Hellboy Darkness Calls, Hellboy The Wild Hunt, Hellboy The Storm and the Fury, which chronologically within the universe of the Hellboy comics take place chronologically near the end of Hellboy's story. Yet the filmmakers decided to take what is essentially the end game of the Hellboy story and make it the first installment of a new set of movies. Now, it'd be one thing if this movie was still being directed by Guillermo del Toro, then I could see this movie utilizing said material, but this is your first installment. It should have adapted some other story like The Conquering Worm. Another problem that I have with the movie has to do with the editing, because it is super sloppy at several points throughout the movie, and I can list two examples. The first example revolves around Hellboy battling the three giants, because for a solid 5 to 3 seconds we see Hellboy's right-handed doom go from his right hand, then to his left, then back to his right hand again. And although it's very brief, it is in the movie long enough that I think most people will notice it. And for my second example, it occurs sometime before Hellboy begins his final fight with Grugoch within the cathedral, in which we see the same walking animation for Grugoch being played twice in a row. Another problem that I have with the movie has to do with the comedy, because the comedy itself isn't very funny, since most of the time the jokes have an already poor setup, which lead to a poor payoff. And this happens quite a bit throughout the whole movie. Although I'll say this much, there was one joke I actually did find funny, which takes the form of that of a head pun. Other than that, the humor in this movie is not very good. And for the final problem that I have with the movie has to do with the way the movie ends, for a couple reasons. Reason number one, it goes on for way too long, to a point that you're mentally clocked out of the movie and don't even want to watch the movie anymore. Reason number two, this movie ends on a cliffhanger promising a sequel featuring Abe Sapien, which we're never gonna get. Reason number three, you really didn't need to have that 2-minute action sequence in Siberia. You easily could just ended the movie on Hellboy patching things up with his dead father's soul in the cathedral, and that would have been a perfect ending for the movie. It would have been weird, but I think that would have been a perfect way to end the movie. And maybe have that Siberian action scene as a mid to post-credit scene. Although I'll say this much, I did find myself laughing quite a bit throughout the movie. It just wasn't because of the jokes. It was mainly due to more ironic reasons because of how poorly made this movie is. in a so bad it's good kind of way. So, for my final verdict of the movie, the 2019 Hellboy reboot is kind of weird, because on one hand, the movie does indeed borrow a lot more elements from the source material, but on the other hand, the way the movie combines these elements doesn't really make the movie feel like a Hellboy movie. Like, if anything, if I had to describe this movie in a nutshell, it's a combination of Suicide Squad, The Army of Darkness, and, strangely enough, The Kid Who Would Be King, which just so happens to feature Hellboy as the main character. Now sure, would I have liked to have seen the third and final installment of the Guillermo del Toro Hellboy trilogy? Yes. But with this movie, on the other hand, I'm at least happy that we even got a third Hellboy movie at all. So, overall, the 2019 Hellboy reboot is a movie that is so bad that it's good. And before I give my final rating, what did everyone else have to say about the 2019 Hellboy reboot? Looks like the movie got generally negative reception. I mean, I know the movie's got a shit ton of problems, but I didn't think it was that bad. And so, for my final rating of the 2019 Hellboy reboot, I give it a 2.5 out of 5. So, within the realm of the Hellboy comics, which is your favorite story arc? And see you later.